Hello and welcome to the RC Industry Podcast, episode 116. For those of you new to the show, I'm comedian Simon Caine, and this is the podcast where I interview the most influential people from the worlds of stand-up, comedy, radio, and today, script and comedy consultancy. Steve Kaplan is one of the industry's most respected experts on comedy. He's consulted on projects with DreamWorks, Disney, HBO, and many more, as well as directed shows which have gone on to win Emmy, Academy Awards, Golden Globes, and pretty much every award that's worth winning in the industry. He's written 2 books, and his most recent book, The Comics Hero Journey, is something that we touch upon, and the way that you structure a show, you structure a story, and you structure the way that you tell the jokes in a way that allows the audience to follow the journey that you're going along as a person or as a performer within the piece. I found it really interesting. I found it very enlightening, and it really offered me a lot of ideas and ways for structuring future shows and future scripts that I'm working through. It was really, really exciting. I felt I came off slightly ignorant at places, but I feel like that's kind of my brand because I largely invite people on. I know enough about that I think they are worth talking to, but I don't know enough about their area of the industry. So at the 2 points, which I think are fairly obvious, that I drop the ball and I sort of make it clear that I'm not amazing at script writing, and I actually do. It's one of my main goals this year to improve on it. I think it's actually okay to leave in. I normally would take out little bits of things like that, but we're all friends here, you know. We all know that I'm going to fuck up at some point, so that's why that's still in there. I hope you get as much out of this as I did. If you'd like to buy either of his first 2 books or the third most recent one called The Comics Hero Journey, I've put links into the show notes. And please tweet him or me and thank either one of us for this episode if you enjoyed it. It really means a lot that you've downloaded it and that you're supporting the show. If you're new here, please don't forget to hit the subscribe button. If you're old here, please do consider giving us an honest, ideally positive review in iTunes. And either way, please do join the Facebook group. It's called RC Industry Podcast and it's on Facebook, obviously. But for now, this is Steve Kaplan.
So what I normally do is I ask the first question and then I ask the guest if they can incorporate that question into their answer, just so that like I can do an intro and then cut and then it's you talking, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think.
So, beg your pardon?
I think it makes sense. I think. Yeah, I'm never going to be 100% sure about anything.
That's a very scientific answer. I thought the first question we could ask is how you came to, because here's the thing, I've got 2 first questions and I don't know which one to start with, and so maybe you can tell me, because your book's just launched, so that's why it's kind of changed what I was originally going to get you to answer first. I don't know whether you want to start with the book or whether you want to start with the Manhattan Punchline Theatre and how that sort of has, in my opinion of what I found of you, sort of informed a lot of your decisions going forward from there.
I mean, yeah, we can start with that. We could start with, earlier, when I was being chased home every day after elementary school, and talk about how I came to think that comedy was going to save my life.
Okay. That's a title of this podcast now. So when was the first time you thought comedy could save your life?
I was a very unpopular kid in elementary school, partly because I was hygienically challenged. I think I wore the same, this was in New York and it was cold and wet and snowy and raining. I think I wore the same sweater for the entire 4th grade. And so, and never got that sweater washed. So every day with the same smelly sweater. So I was not a very popular kid. And so I discovered that if somehow I could make the class laugh, that would be a measure of acceptance for me. But I had a very poor ratio. Like for every 13 things that I shouted out, 12 of them would be met with silence or outright angry glares. One of them would make the class laugh. But to me, that was a good place to start. Kind of like being a 10-year-old stand-up comic. Just accepting the failure in the search of the one successful set. Also, I was being beaten up a lot after school, and I found out that if I couldn't outrun my attackers, sometimes I could make them laugh when they caught me. Again, there was a very poor ratio involved in being caught and making them laugh. But I at a very early age, I somehow gravitated to all things comedy. Watch comedy movies, the sitcoms. I remember I was at a dance once. I think I was 12 or 13 or 14 years old. And I embarrassedly asked the band who was asking for suggestions, requests. And I remember I went up there and I said, "Can you do Thanks for the Memory?" Because to me, that was the greatest song in the world. That was, the Bob Hope song. So I was fascinated. I wanted to do this. As I grew older, I realized that I had limited capacity to make people laugh by myself. I was what I would consider to be a bad comic and a bad actor. But I appreciated what good comics and good actors could do. So when I got an opportunity, not too long after college, a couple of actor friends of mine wanted to start a theater company, and they asked me to come along with them. And so they pitched several ideas. And for me, the last thing in the world I wanted to do was to produce another production of the Three Sisters all in black turtlenecks. To me, I pitched them the idea that let's start a theater company that was devoted to comedy, all comedy. And at the time in New York, that wasn't a very popular or commercial idea. This was way before Chris Durang came around and Wendy Wasserstein. And so we kind of...
So when was this? Just to put a date on it for people who...
This was 1979.
Okay, so late 70s, early 80s. Okay.
Yeah. And so we started this company, Manhattan Punchline, and we produced comic plays. We had stand-up nights. We had an improv group. We had a sketch comedy group. We did all things comedy, and a lot of great people came out of it. David Crane, who went on to do Friends and Episodes, Oliver Platt, and who's Nathan Lane, and Michael Patrick King, who later was the executive producer of Sex and the City and Two Broke Girls. He was the main person in our improv group. So a lot of great people came out of it, and people who are showrunners and executive producers of sitcoms now. And so when I started it, I thought I knew everything there was to know about comedy in the arrogance of youth. And after doing it for a couple of years and directing, doing a little bit of acting, again, not very well, and putting something up, directing something and thinking it would be successful and seeing that it was not, I thought to myself, okay, I don't know everything there is to know about comedy, but I know what's funny, God damn it. And shortly after that, I thought to myself, can I curse on a podcast? I guess so. How the fuck does this stuff work? Why is something funny on a Thursday no longer funny on a Sunday? Why is a play sometimes the funniest the first time you get around a table and read it, but after you work on it, it gets less and less funny? So I was just fascinated and obsessed with the idea of how does this stuff work? Because I've been told by lots of people, you're either funny or you're not. You're born funny. Although I don't think anybody's ever seen a baby being delivered, being slapped on the butt, and then turn around and tell the doctor, a funny thing happened to me through the fallopian tubes. That just doesn't happen. So I started almost by accident to investigate what I thought would be the art and science of comedy, what I eventually called the hidden tools of comedy. And that I started working with actors. When I came to Los Angeles, somebody said, why don't you do this for writers? So I started doing workshops for writers. I did workshops at DreamWorks and Disney Animation. And that led to my first book, which is The Hidden Tools of Comedy. And then my second book, which was about a story structure for comic films, and that was The Comic Hero's Journey. So that's how that happened. It happened because I was unpopular, I was unhygienic, I was getting beaten up, and I discovered that if I could get the class to laugh for that millisecond, they accepted and liked it. Ray Romano once said that if he had gotten hugged once as a kid, he'd become an accountant. So I think that's a similar story.
I don't like the cliche that every comic sort of wasn't hugged enough or wasn't the popular kid, but I would say that it is not a cliche it's a cliche for a reason.
It's not uncommon. I think what's true for everybody, having done a lot of reading and a lot of research, is that if you look into the background of any comic person, comedian, writer, producer, what you find is that when they were children, they were as fascinated with comedy and comedians and funny bits as other children are fascinated with following a sports team. And John Cleese's autobiography talks about the fact that when he was a schoolboy, he would listen to the Goon Show and come back the next day and in the schoolyard recite those bits for his schoolmates. And that's true for everybody. I mean, Judd Apatow famously, when he was in high school, a 15-year-old, he interviewed all these great comedians, because I think we're all fascinated with the mechanics of how this stuff works. Why does it work? What's happening when it doesn't work? And what can you do to fix it? Which is what my first book was all about.
Have you found that by breaking down and making an analysis of a joke or of a script or of an idea, you can or you have overthought it to the point where it kind of isn't? It's kind of the dissecting the frog analogy, where you can dissect the frog, but then it just won't be alive anymore.
Right. Yeah. It's you have a dead frog.
Yeah. You overthink a joke too much.
Well, if you listen to Jerry Seinfeld, he's done this. He's done a couple of films about the art of comedy, and they talk about the fact that they focus on a syllable. If they can get the syllables right in a sentence, they can get the joke to pay off. So I think the myth that you can't, it's all magic and there's no work involved. I think that's a myth. When I was in New York, a lot of my friends were stand-ups, and they would dissect their jokes like Talmudic scholars, going over the Torah, the little nuances, and I think that you can overthink it, but what I try to do in terms of my work is we set out basic principles, and as long as the principles are in alignment, things should go okay. Now, whether you get an audience to laugh or not, that's something different. I draw a distinction between comedy and funny. Funny is whatever makes you laugh. Hey, if you're a racist, you might laugh at a KKK joke, right? If you're a Nazi, you might laugh at a Holocaust joke. And even some Jews laugh at Holocaust jokes. Look at The Producers, by Mel Brooks. But comedy isn't necessarily what makes people laugh. Comedy is telling the truth, and specifically telling the truth about people. I was at a stand-up club last night, and it was a benefit for an acquaintance of mine who's unfortunately dying of this horrible cancer. And so, in order to pay his medical bills, because we live in a country where it's our right to carry a gun, but it's not our right to have medical attention. And in order to pay their bills, they organized this stand-up benefit, and there were like 6 comics on. And 4 of the comics just told stories about their life. I mean, Bobcat Goldthwait was one of the comics, and he was brilliant. And he told this story about how he almost died in a plane crash. And it was hysterical. But 2 of the comics got out there with shtick. I mean, this one unfortunate female comic, she came out and said, "Woo! Everything was woo! Here's my vagina, woo!" And it was such false shtick that, this audience that was just rollicking along with all these great comedians, and Billy Martin from, who writes with, with Bill Maher on Real Time, and John Ricci, who's a great writer for comedy shows. They were brilliantly funny. And then, woo! And everything was punctuated by this screech, as though it was one of those, that bad comedian that they had on SNL, the parody of the bad comedian, the bad, Latin comedian who says, who would punctuate all his jokes with banging on the drums. And it was painful. And then there was another guy who came out, and again, he was forcing himself to be crazy, and it just didn't work. So right there was an example of people coming from an authentic place, telling the truth about themselves with their specific point of views, with their very sharply crafted expression. It's not like they're just improvising. I mean, this is crafted material, but it comes from a more comic place, a more truthful place than people who come out with shtick and noises and woo, as though that's what comedy is. Comedy, in effect, is telling the truth, and specifically it's telling the truth about people, and even more specifically, it's telling the truth about yourself, because every joke is autobiographic. Every script is autobiography. Even if it's other characters, you're telling a truth about yourself, about the way you see the world, the way you perceive the world, the way the world appears to you off kilter, and you're just describing that, giving that to an audience.
Yeah, I get what you mean about that. I think do you think that's unique to the American sort of circuit and scene, or do you think that's because you've obviously sort of taught everywhere, like you've taught all over the place, and I'm wondering whether is
I'm going
something
to Milan next week, and then in February I'm going to Brussels. But there are. I mean, you could make a joke about Theresa May, and I might not, or even more obscurely, some obscure minister that everybody in your neck of the woods knows, and it gets a big laugh, and I'm just going, well, I guess that's some British politician. I don't know who it is. So you can make a joke about that, but if you make a joke about your relationship, how you live, how hard it is to live, wherever you live, I'm going to relate to that. In fact, the more specific your jokes are, the more the humor will translate. What I found going around the world is that comedy has more similarity around the world than it has differences. Now, I might find some wordplay in Singapore that I don't get, and I'll say you'll have to explain that to me. Why is that funny? But for the most part, I've seen films from Singapore, from Ukraine, from Brazil, and I understand it because it's just people trying to navigate through a world that's strange to them and they barely comprehend, but they have to comprehend it. And to me, that's comedy. So in my first book, we have what we call the comic equation. It's a paradigm that I think translates to wherever I go. If you take out politics, if you take out specific culture, and even sometimes the culture of some place, I might not get the exact joke, but I get the comedy of it. Comedy's about an ordinary guy or gal, or less than ordinary, struggling against insurmountable odds without many of the required skills and tools to win, yet never giving up hope. And doesn't that describe almost every British sitcom that you can think of? Faulty Towers, The Fall and Rise of, now I forget the name of that great old sitcom. I used to love that. Reginald something or other. And Stephen Fry used to say that the difference between American humor and British humor is American humor is aspirational, whereas British humor already acknowledges that they're losers and acknowledges the pathetic nihilism of the whole thing. And that may or may not be true. It probably is true. But but beneath both those kinds of humors are imperfect humans struggling to make it in an even more imperfect and unknowable world. And as long as the characters continue to hope, because if they didn't hope, wouldn't they just kill themselves? It's even in British sitcom. If it was hopeless, you just take a pill and go to sleep and hope you never wake up. But even in British sitcoms, those hopeless, hapless characters still wake up the next day trying to make the best of a bad lot. That's comedy. That's the truth about life.
So I listened to a couple of interviews that you'd done before for preparation for this, and I remember
repeating myself a lot. You've heard the same jokes over and over. Okay.
That wasn't what I was saying, but yes, I have. No, yeah, but they're funny. So no, I remember hearing a couple of times you talking about how, so for example, especially in the new book, how there is kind of, I think you said that you plagiarized it off of, not the whole book obviously, but you plagiarized the idea off of The Hero of a Thousand Faces, and the idea of it being the comedic version of that. And
right.
And I always found the essence of the idea of there being a, because this is the thing, I've sort of been around the circuit enough times now to see that everyone's kind of saying a very similar thing, but in their own way.
Right.
And so I wonder how the book addresses people being able to find their way of telling their story.
Well, in the book about story structure, The Comic Hero's Journey, basically all I'm doing is I'm saying that Joseph Campbell talks about a monomyth. In other words, one story that represents all stories, that Beowulf is the same story as Star Wars. And all I'm saying in terms of using that format or that template for a comedy is that there are several important differences. And it's not that you're writing to a formula, but certain things are, I think, important. And if you're not adhering to that, you at least have to have a really good reason. For instance, in a dramatic story or an action story, you have somebody who is a hero who has greatness within them, right? Luke Skywalker has greatness within him. He tracks the droids. He risks death. He in the beginning of the film, even before he meets up with Obi-Wan Kenobi, he's brave, he's resolute, he's everything you'd want a hero to be. He just hasn't been given the opportunity to express it. He has the Force within him, but he hasn't been taught how to use it. But in a comedy, our heroes do not have greatness within them. Our heroes are as far from greatness within as is humanly possible. Our heroes are us. They're misshapen, misbegotten, blokes who are just kind of bumbling through their lives. And if not for an extraordinary event, they would continue to bumble through their lives. But because of the extraordinary event in a comedy, they are forced to transform. They're forced to become something that they are not. In Groundhog Day, which is one of my favorite films, does Bill Murray have greatness within him? No, he's a sarcastic, cynical, womanizing jerk. But because he's forced to live the same day over and over again, and at first he thinks, oh, this is great. I can sleep with whoever I want to. I can rob an armored truck and have all the money I want. But every day he wakes up and it's the same day. And it's the same situation. And eventually he gets tired of that. And he's forced to become a different person, a better person. And you see this in many comedy. In As Good as It Gets, Jack Nicholson famously says to Helen Hunt, he says, I think it's Helen Hunt. I think that's the actress he's working against. He takes her out to dinner, and he's this mass of idiosyncratic behaviors and OCD and all this stuff, all these disorders. And she says, why don't you say something nice to me, for instance? Because he famously just insults everybody and is antisocial. And he says to her, I wish I could be the man that you would like. I mean, and to me, that's very indicative of a comedy that our characters start off as less than, and because of circumstances beyond their control. In Groundhog Day, he's living the same day over and over again. In Big, he becomes a 30-year-old man. In 40-Year-Old Virgin, Steve Carell's secret is exposed, and he's forced to do something about it. They're forced out of their comfort zone. They're forced into a new place, and they have to, not because they want to. I mean, Luke wants to join the rebellion. He wants to be a pilot. He wants to do daring do. Steve Carell doesn't want to date girls. You know, he says, I respect women. I respect them so much, I stay the hell away from them. But they're forced to do something that is not within them, and therefore they have to transform. So all comedy in long form narrative, is transformative. And so is that a formula? I don't think so. And in my book, I take pains to say that there's a journey that a comic hero goes through. But it doesn't happen on this doesn't happen on page 12. That doesn't have to happen by page 37. A comic hero starts in the normal world, and they think that world is working well for them. So here's the principle. If your character is aware that their world isn't working, you've written a drama. You've written a drama where they're going to be looking soulfully out into the camera. You know, they're going to be drinking scotch, you know, musing about themselves. But most comic characters are not aware that their life isn't working. They're making do just as well as they can. So the normal world is about them not knowing how really screwed up they are. And then comes along what we call the what the fuck moment, the WTF, in which something absurd or impossible or improbable happens that forces them out from their comfort zone. And then as that happens, these characters begin to form relationships with other people where they had none. They form, and it's not always love relationships, but it's just forming allies, what we call the discovered goal. Dramas or action films, oftentimes our characters have a single goal. In Die Hard, Bruce Willis's goal is to save his wife and kill the terrorists. As soon as the terrorists take over, that's his goal. That's who he is. He's a cop. He's going to do it. Luke Skywalker wants to join the rebellion. That's his goal. Then that's what he eventually gets to do. But Steve Carell's goal in the beginning of 40-Year-Old Virgin is not to have a relationship with a woman. It's exactly the opposite. It's to just play with his toy soldiers, you know, play Halo on his PlayStation, go to work, watch Survivor with his friends from the upstairs apartment, and that's it. So in a comedy, the comic hero has a discovered goal. This is a goal that they had no idea that they wanted in the beginning of the movie or in the beginning of the narrative. Had no idea, but because they're transforming throughout the narrative, they're becoming a different person. They have different wants and needs. They have a different goal. But there are similarities. In many movies, there's the all is lost moment. That's still true for a comic hero. But again, they're principles. So if you have a character who starts off the movie, the narrative, as a broken figure, then I just read a screenplay where a guy starts off his narrative as a guy who has two really good jobs and a fiancée, and his only problem is he's got to get enough money to fix his hotel. And I said to him, you've already started 90% of the way to where this guy is going to end up. So there isn't much of a journey for him. There isn't much of an arc. Why don't you not make him have a fiancée? Why don't you make the girl somebody that he likes? But if this guy isn't formed, he isn't a fully expressed human being, maybe he hasn't figured out how to ask her out on a date yet. Maybe that's something that he's going to discover as he goes through the story. Why don't give him this great job? Why, if he's got this great job where he has one problem and he's got this hotel, why doesn't he just sell the hotel? Give him a reason for having to invest so much to get this hotel going. Don't make him the head designer. Make him a clerk who's got aspirations. One of my favorite movies is 500 Days of Summer, a great movie with Joseph Gordon-Levitt. And in the beginning of the movie, he's working at a job that he doesn't like. He's writing the filler for greeting cards. So if you started him off as an architect, which he ends up as, where do you have to go? What's brilliant about the movie is that he flirts with the idea, yeah, maybe I could be an architect, when someone says, oh, what would you rather be? But he crumples, he draws a little picture and then he realizes, no. He crumples it up, he throws it away. That's a brilliant moment for a comedy. So comedies don't have to be yuck. They just have to tell the truth in their own specific way. Truth can be as absurd as Airplane, and it can be as subtle as Enough Said, which is the last film that James Gandolfini did with Julia Louis-Dreyfus, which is a very small film. Julia Louis-Dreyfus plays a massage therapist, and there's no big supernatural event that changes everything. No, she starts dating this guy at the same time that she has a new best friend who's a massage therapy client. It just turns out that the new best friend is the ex-wife of the new boyfriend, and everything she tells her about the boyfriend starts to ruin her relationship with James Gandolfini. Now, is that an impossible situation? No, but it's improbable. It's improbable that you wouldn't say, hey, I think I'm giving massages to your ex-wife. It's improbable that you would keep it a secret. So it doesn't need to be a big supernatural thing like in Big or Groundhog Day, but it just needs to be something that's impossible or improbable that our broken heroes, proto-heroes, have to deal with. So that's a long way of answering your question. That it's not about following a formula. It's really about fixing on principles that will help you tell your story in your own way.
Hello there. I hope you're enjoying this interview as much as I'm enjoying putting it together. As you may or may not have noticed, depending on whether or not this is your first episode listening to the show or not, there are now mid-roll ads within the podcast. This is largely because I need to make the podcast make money. Sorry about that. That is that's just a fact. The podcast makes a giant loss, and if you want it to continue, the ads are going to have to be in place. I was listening back to some of them and talking to a few friends about this, and it feels a little bit odd to just immediately cut in the middle of an interview to an ad without any warning or notice. So that's what this is really. I'm basically letting you know that there's about to be an ad that will come up and will play in the middle of this episode. If you would like copies of this podcast that do not have ads, you can become a patron from $1 an episode. That's 80p roughly if you're English, and most of this audience is. So if you would like to donate $1, because it's an American website. If you'd like to donate $1 per episode, you'll get an episode that has no ads, and you can just listen to it on the podcast player of your choice. You can do that at patreon.com/RC Industry Podcast. Not only that, but you help me have a budget for future episodes. So that's exciting, and that's really cool, isn't it? Now, the problem here I've got is not everyone who downloads the podcast gets a mid-roll ad, because if they don't have any ads for the mid-roll, they just don't include it in the episode. So as a result, I'm about to say, here comes your mid-roll ad, and there might not be one. So here comes a mid-roll ad, or a very weird intro to nothing. Did you get an ad? Did you get an ad? I can't tell. I don't know. I'm putting the thing together. They add the ads in later. Did you get an ad? How was the ad? Was the ad good? I hope the ad was good. I have to approve or deny most of the ads. So if it wasn't a good ad, let me know. But if it was a good ad, let me know as well. I'd love to talk to you about which ads you're really enjoying. Thank you very much for putting up with that advert. Thank you very much for putting up with my ramblings in the middle of the podcast. As I said, if you want to avoid ads and these rambles, please become a patron of the podcast. It costs you 80p or $1 just to remove these ads, essentially, and keep the project going. Yeah, that's all I have to say about that. Hope you enjoyed this little mid-roll feature that I'm going to start incorporating into more episodes. I guess we'll get back to the podcast now, shan't we? Let's dive back in.
And that's your, I don't want to call it this, but your day job, essentially. You script edit and work one-on-one with with writers and performers who are working on ideas.
Yes.
And I was wondering, at what stage do people, or should people, approach you with an idea, or do you approach them? Because I know the HBO Writers Room, for example, I assume was to field ideas from writers and to field people to come to you and have a more formalized way of doing that.
Well, I do two things. I go around the world doing these 2 or 3 or 4 day workshops, kind of like Robert McKee, but for comic. And I also work with writers and producers and studios in terms of working on scripts, and it could be as early as when somebody's working on a treatment. I worked on a lot of treatments, or a finished script, so that I could be given a script that's in its 5th draft and they just want to get one more eye on it, one more third eye to see if they've missed anything or missed any important points. And when I do that, occasionally, because again, I'm not a stand-up comic, and occasionally I'll come up with a funny line that I'll pitch. Here, what about if this person says X instead of Y? But for the most part, what I'm looking at is, what is the theme of the movie? Because what I find is that most people have kind of a vague idea of what the theme is about, but they have a really good idea of what the circumstances, the situation, the characters. But for me, the best way to develop a feature is to marry the character propelled by the premise, guided by the theme. What's the meaning of it? At some point, somebody's going to say, what's this movie about? And they're not asking what's the premise of the movie, what's the situation. It's what are you talking about? What is the real purpose of the movie? For instance, in Groundhog Day, which is a movie that was originally thought to be, it's going to be a light summer feature. And the movie had this scene where the second day that Bill Murray, Phil Connors, discovers that he's living the same day, he decides to figure if it's really happening. So what he does is, in the script, you can Google it. You just write in Groundhog Day, and what will usually come up is the second draft that Danny Rubin did with Harold Ramis. And it comes up right online. You can download it. You can read it. And in the second draft, what happens is he cuts his hair into a mohawk. He trashes his room like he's a rock star. And he wakes up the next day, and it's all the same. It's the same as it always was. And they shot it. And when they looked at it, they thought to themselves, why would he do that? Because this is a story about Groundhog Day. The theme of Groundhog Day is, how can you be a mensch in the word? And mensch is a Yiddish word that means like a good person, a man. And so if this is a story about a guy just trying to figure out how to be a good person, why would he cut his hair into a mohawk? How would that help him? How does that show him struggling with it? So they, at great expense, they reshot the scene. And if you watch the movie, all he does at that same moment in the script is he breaks a pencil. He puts one part on the night table and one part on the floor. And when the next, when the scene then cuts to the next day and you hear Sonny and Cher singing, I Got You, Babe, he wakes up and he finds the pencil, and that's it. Now he knows that he's really living the same day over and over again. So that's following following the movie thematically, as opposed to having plot dictate. And most unsuccessful comedy, I think, make the mistake of putting plot bits in front of character and theme. So what I try to do when working with writers is, because I'm new to the project, I'm cognizant. I'm just very aware of what this movie is trying to say and what it means beyond the silly characters and the jokes, and just trying to make sure that they don't veer too far from it as they develop the narrative. What is this movie trying to say? What are they really trying to do? What would this character really do in that situation? Not what would be funny for this character to do, but what would the character really do? Because 9 times out of 10, if you answer the question, what would this character do? You're going to come up with something as good, if not funnier, than what would be the funny thing to do. Because I come back to my original statement, funny is different from comedy. What you think is funny is different from what I think is funny. So if you chase funny, if you're chasing funny, you're going to leave a certain percentage of the audience out. Because a certain percentage is going to think, no, that's not funny. Whereas a certain percentage will think, yeah, that's funny. But if you write about what's comic, what's human, what's true, then whether people laugh or not, they're going to follow it. They're going to empathize with it. They're going to buy into that story because it's truthful. Even if you didn't think it was funny, it's truthful. Because if you go to a film or a TV show that you think, this is no good, and what you'll find, the parts where you're not liking it, they're trying to make you laugh as opposed to telling you the truth. Whereas the shows that you like, they're making you laugh and they're telling you the truth at the same time. Sometimes you're not laughing, but you're still going, yeah, I get it. One of my favorite new sitcoms is a very unfunny comedy. I wouldn't say unfunny, but it's not trying to be funny. It's just so heartbreaking and true. Kidding, the new Jim Carrey sitcom, in which he plays a Mr. Rogers kind of character who's going through some horrible situation with his life. And it's heartbreaking, but it's also well within the comic realm. It's not a tragedy. It's not Ingmar Bergman. It's still within the comic realm. And so I try to, when working with writers, I try to help them achieve their best version of their best voice, as opposed to, here's what I think is funny, you should do that.
Did you, because you said that you were trying out comedy before you then moved into essentially the behind the scenes version of it. Did you ever do any, try any characters, like be a character yourself? Because it sounds like you're able to just embed yourself into characters in a way that would lend itself to you doing live character work yourself.
Well, I did improv. I was in an improv group. And in fact, I always tell writers that the one thing they should do, or one of the things that they should always do, is take improv classes. Because even if they don't want to perform, they need to know what it's like to look through a character's eyes, hear through a character's ears. So yeah, I mean, I did that, and when I work on a script, I'm always trying to put myself in the shoes of that character. What would that character say? What would that character really do? And sometimes that brings me and the writer to a place that they hadn't thought of yet, and might work better in that moment.
How are you? So when you're like script editing and when you're directing shows and ideas that you haven't come up with but people have come to you with, how do you make sure that you don't take over the project with how you would do it and instead just enhance their project? Because
I guess because I'm honoring the character that they've created, and the situation that they've created, the premise that they've created, and more than anything else, I don't give answers. I ask questions, and I'll say, "Why is the character doing this here?" And if they tell me, they give me a good reason, I'll go, "Oh, okay." But if they give me a reason like, "Well, I thought it would be funny," then I'll ask you another question. Doesn't he want X? Why isn't he trying to do X? So my methodology is not to invent on top of their invention as much as try to see the world through that character's eyes. And if the way I see the character isn't the way the character's acting, I'll ask a question. I could be wrong. That's why when I work, I do not write up a list of notes, send them off, and that's it. Because to me, a consultation is an interactive activity that depends upon the input of both parts. I'm asking questions, the writer's giving answer, or the director or the producer's giving answers, and sometimes through those conversations, we come up with a new direction that neither one of us had thought of in the beginning, that come out of that conversation, those questions.
Do you ever find, so when I first started in comedy, and I think this is a common trope for people doing live performing in particular, you kind of have a fear that the audience are going to hate you, and so you kind of rush to try and be as funny as possible. Not in like a because obviously you want to be funny, but you kind of aren't thinking about why you're being funny. You're kind of just like, that worked, I'll stick to it. That kind of worked, I'll do that again. And it's not, you're not thinking, would who I'm being on stage say that, or would who I'm portraying be interested in talking about that? And it sounds like what you're trying, or what you do, is sort of refine people's attention to what would be of interest to that specific scenario.
Yeah,
I mean, fair?
Yeah, and first, I don't teach stand-up per se, but when I've worked with stand-ups, what we're working on is, who's your persona? How does this persona see the world? How is that vision different from somebody else's vision? If you look at the career of George Carlin, I mean, he's a very different person when he's playing the hippy-dippy weatherman than in his later years, where he's just playing this cranky old guy who tells the truth, however he sees it, and he doesn't care what you think. That's persona. I mean, when I was in New York working, and a lot of my friends were stand-ups, they would often tell another stand-up, I wrote this joke, but I can't use it because it's not me. It's not my on-stage persona. Why don't you, this would fit you better. So that it's not about telling a random series of funny one-liners. It's really about creating a character that sees the world in a particular way and has a very specific way of expressing it. So again, what I say is, with stand-ups, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to get them to focus on, who is this persona? Who am I? How do I see the world? And how do I express that through this material, through this bit? As opposed to, what is the funniest thing I can do and say right now? Because again, if you chase funny, a percentage of the people who are listening aren't going to agree with you. So don't be focused on funny as opposed to comedy, as opposed to who is this character and what is he struggling with and dealing with right now. And of course, there's all the attention that needs to be paid on material, on sharpening and shaping the material to get the best response. So it's not just, I'm going to tell the truth about myself, like some of these alternative comics, I'm putting them in air quotes, alternative comics who basically just get up and kind of vomit out their day without it being shaped at all. It requires great editing and shaping and choice of words, choice of syntax. But underneath that has to be just telling your own truth as far as who that persona is if you're a stand-up.
It feels like counterintuitive advice, though, because if your main aim as a writer or a performer is to be funny, by definition, as a comedian or as a person who's made a script for a sitcom or a comedy film, for example, it seems odd to focus on the characters over the jokes. As someone who's never written a film, I should point that out. It would be so, like, I've written sitcom ideas and things, and I always find I'm more interested in the situation and how that can be funny than the characters. And so,
what's your favorite sitcom?
At the moment, Brooklyn Nine-Nine.
Okay. Could the things that Terry Crews says be the same things as what Chelsea Peretti says?
No.
So you have to focus on character. You have them in this situation, but how they relate to the situation, what they see in that situation, what they focus on in that situation, comes out of character. I mean, the comedy comes from, Charles, for instance, who's, Joe Regal, what's his name? Some long Italian name. But the character, the guy who plays Charles, he's such a crazy idiot who's, he's like this foodie. So if they're on a, and he just adores, he worships Andy Samberg. So if he's in a situation in which Samberg says, "Let's have a cheeseburger," what would Charles say? "Oh, that's so great, cheese!" Plus you know who Charles is. So you're really working for for character through character. One of my favorite sitcoms, it's kind of a classically made sitcom, is Everybody Loves Raymond. And what they talked about, what Phil Rosenthal and Steve Skrovan used to be one of the executive producers and was one of my students back in New York. What they talked about is the fact that they didn't write a lot of jokes. In fact, that they would take jokes out because it got in the way of telling the story and telling the story about the character. So you can start with your idea. You can start with anything. You can start with just an image in your head. You can start with writing down all the funny things you want to write about. But when you put it together, when things aren't working, and this is the important thing, you want to just let it pour out of you. And if it's pouring out of you, and if it's golden, great. Don't edit it. Don't overthink it. But when things aren't working, when things are flat, when you think this isn't working, that's when you go to character and theme. Not so much in a sitcom, but definitely character. If this isn't funny, if this joke isn't funny, at least let the character say something that's indicative of the character and develops the character and develops the story. If it's not going to, if my bad joke isn't going to work, why replace it with another bad joke? Have the character say something true, and it might be the funniest thing that you could write. In fact, you're familiar with Seinfeld, right?
Actually, no.
Okay.
I'm Jerry Seinfeld live. I've never actually seen Seinfeld.
You've never seen an episode of Seinfeld?
Never seen Seinfeld. I keep getting told to watch it, and the problem is people play.
You don't have to like it, but they have a very famous episode in which they have a contest. It's called The Contest, and they're trying to see who can go the longest without masturbating.
I'm aware of this. I've seen the scene of this, but I've not seen an episode. So.
And they don't use the word masturbating. They use master my own domain. And so there's a scene, I think this is like scene 3, and they notice that outside the window, across the street, there's a lady naked in her apartment, and they're just watching it, and they're watching it, and all of a sudden, Kramer gets all kinky, and he exits. Elaine comes in, and there's talking, and have you done it yet? No, this is going to be easy. And then Kramer comes back, slams his fist down on the table with a bunch of money, and says, "I'm out. I'm out." What is so funny about "I'm out"? "I'm out" isn't a great joke, but it's the character in the situation. You know that he just went across the hall to his own apartment and did it because he got all excited about watching the naked lady outside the window. That's one of the longest laughs that they ever had to hold for in Seinfeld because of character, as opposed to, let me come up with a funny joke. Now, was it a funny bit? It was very funny, but not because somebody said something clever or said a joke, but because a character reacted in character to the situation.
Makes sense.
And now you have to go with Seinfeld.
I will watch that episode after this. Literally, I was just thinking to myself, I want to write a note somewhere although I'll probably hear it again when I edit it back later, and I'll just do it then. It's more, I've got this habit of if people tell me how I should feel about the thing too much, I don't want to see the thing. So it's like,
how about this? How about this? I'm not going to tell you. I'm interested to know how you react to it. As opposed, you have to watch it.
I will let you know. Okay. I will let you know. It was a bit like with Ghostbusters, the reboot one, if you like. Everyone was giving me, either it was amazing or either it was the worst thing ever. And because everyone was trying to tell me how to feel, I was like, I just don't want to do it. So yeah. I was going to quickly ask you then about how format makes a difference to writing. So not as in the actual thing, as in moving. So for example, watching it on the big screen or watching it on your TV or watching it on your phone, and whether you have to take that into account now when you're thinking about how people will consume, say, for example, a Netflix special that they could be watching on a train or a commute versus a film they might actually sit down and watch.
That's a great question. I have no idea. I can make a guess, but I don't have firsthand knowledge of people struggling with that. My guess is that they do it for its optimal viewing format. If you're making a TV show, what does this look like on TV? They're making a movie, what does this look like on a movie? And then they leave it to people who know about that stuff, how it will translate to watching it on your iPhone. My guess is that the creators, certainly the writers, aren't worried about how this will happen on an iPhone. However, if you're doing a web series, then you are focused on what will this look like when I see it on my phone, because they're creating material not for somebody to sit and watch it on a computer, because so few people do that. You millennials, so few people do that nowadays. They're thinking about, when I do this, this is going to be watched on a phone, so how will it look like when I do it? That's my best guess, but having not really had to deal with that problem in real life, I'm left to theorize as opposed to give you experience.
So that doesn't come into place when you're editing a script. You don't think about where it would. Because
No,
also I imagine
I'm just trying to figure out what's going on, who is this character, and what do they want. What is the obstacle, either internal or external, in getting what they want, and what would they say? How do they express themselves?
Okay. I'm going to ask you the very last quick fire questions. They're quick for me. Take as long as you like. What is the biggest mistake you've ever made, and how did you overcome it?
The biggest mistake I ever made was at a certain point in my career, I got involved with these people who were talent managers. And they said, why don't you come aboard and be a talent manager? And I thought, well, my skills is in kind of discovering and developing comic talent, so maybe that would work. And it turned out that I was a terrible manager because I hate rejection. And being a manager is all about being rejected. So I would call somebody up and say, what about that script I sent you? And they would go, it's not for us. And I would feel like, oh, I just got to play some computer games for a couple of hours now. It feels really bad. There's a saying in the representation business: don't smell it, sell it. But I'm somebody who was all about the art of it and how good it was. And so on the one hand, I hated being rejected. And on the other hand, the other thing that's terrible about being a talent manager is that clients break up with you. I mean, you get somebody a big role, and then they say, I like you as a person. You're a really nice guy, but why do I need a manager and an agent? So it was like getting broken up with a girl every week. It was horrible, and I was glad to get out of it. But so that was, to me, that was my biggest mistake, is in leaving what I had been doing my whole life, which is working with writers, working with directors, working on content, discovering talent and helping to develop talent. When I tried to sell talent, I was not. That was outside of my comfort zone, and I was no good. You out there who I might have represented, I am so sorry.
What is the biggest misconception people have about what you do?
That comedy is something you're born with. You're just born funny. Now, are you a stand-up?
Yeah.
Okay. Have you ever done a gig that bombed?
Yeah.
But you're funny, so shouldn't you be funny all the time? So I think people, the misconception is that comedy is about laughing, comedy is about funny, and that if you're funny, you're funny. And there's that's it. That's the end of the conversation, and that's not true. You're a funny guy, and yet you go out sometimes and people don't like you. Does that mean you're not funny? No, it just means that that one experience didn't go as well as you hoped it would, and that you maybe have some work to do on that material or that presentation.
I was going to say, all the audience just weren't right for it.
You see, that's where I would disagree with, because as a producer, because I produced live theater. As a producer, I would stand in the back of the audience, and the actors would come out and say, "What a terrible audience!" And yet, I was in the audience, and I wasn't terrible, and I was ready to laugh. Something would be happening on stage that they weren't aware of. That's what started me on this exploration, that actors were doing something that they had no idea what was happening or what the effect was. And they were blaming the audience when, in fact, they were doing something that was changing the experience for us. And that's when I started to try to work on what is comedy, how does it work, why does it work, what's happening when it doesn't work, and how can you fix it when it doesn't, which is what my work has all been about.
Who do you think is the most underrated person in the industry?
Me? No. Okay. Person. I have a different answer for that. On a different day or a different month. I used to love the Drew Carey show. I thought it was brilliant. It never got any awards. I thought he was underrated. I think Episodes and Kidding are great sitcoms. I think that's underrated. Who's the most underrated? I don't know, because if they're known, then they're rated. So I think that I would have to think about it. I'm not sure. I'm not sure I have the ready answer for that. I'm so focused on films and television that I'm not as current on stand-ups as I should be. And there's probably stand-ups who are great, who are underrated, who I should know about but don't.
It could be someone.
Heidi Regan.
Don't know who that is.
Okay, you think she's underrated?
No, it's just it's always an interesting question to ask, because I'm trying to ascertain who people work with who are maybe not famous, or maybe are known but only known in the circle that the person I'm interviewing are in, and so it kind of gets me down another rabbit hole of googling a new person and seeing who is. Oh,
Josh Lawson.
Why him?
He's a great writer and a great filmmaker. He was on the cast of House of Lies. But he also wrote this great film called A Small Death that I did some consultation on. But more importantly, he wrote and directed and starred in a short that was nominated for an Oscar last year. And not very many people know who Josh Lawson is. But if you're looking for somebody who you don't know, who you should check out, Josh Lawson.
I'll give him a Google. Right, okay. Well, thank you very much for coming on.
Thank you.
That was Steve. I loved hearing about how long-form comedy can be transformative, how you might need to change, or it might be something in the world that needs to change. If you've written a world where a character knows their world isn't working, you've written a drama. What a lovely way of putting it and explaining to people if their work isn't working in the way they want it to and the genre it wanted to. It's just such a capitalized way of looking at it. I love that. I think I think the reverse of that, he said, was if you've written a character who doesn't know their world isn't working, you've written a comedy. Beautifully. Oh, he's so succinct. You can tell he just finished writing a book, can't you? I really love that. I got loads out of that and I really enjoyed it. I hope you did as well. If you did, feel free to tweet either me or Steve, and the link should be in the show notes. It really helps to say thanks to the guests. And me, by the way. I spend hours editing these, so it's nice to know when people have listened to them and enjoyed them. Don't feel like you can't DM me on Facebook if we're not friends. A lot of people recently started DMing me and apologising before they send it. They've been like, oh, I'm really sorry because I know we're not friends. I hope this isn't too weird. Absolutely fine. Okay, my DMs are open for a reason. So if you, same on Twitter, you can DM me on Twitter if you don't want to do it publicly. So yeah, if you'd like to thank me for any of the work that's gone into this, I'd massively appreciate it. That can be done through a thanks or a subscription or a review on iTunes. Ideally a 5-star, but if not, a 4-star that reads like a 5-star would be just as good. And if not, you can donate. Have you got a couple of quid knocking about? Have you got enough to become a patron from $1 an episode? That's 80p. 80p? Do you reckon what you just heard was worth 80p? Seriously, can you afford that? I think you can. If you can, I'd really appreciate it. If you can't afford it, don't worry. This podcast is on me. Just come see me when I'm doing a show near you or something. But yeah, speaking of which, if you have a look in the show notes, you'll see there is a little image that tells you where I'm going to be in the next couple of months. Doing a lot of previews up and down the country, and I'd love to see you at one of them. If you can come down, please do. I don't even want to run you through all the cities, but I'm doing 35 previews, I think, in between now and August. So yeah, please do come to that. I'm also signed up to Edinburgh. The name of the new show is Every Room Becomes a Panic Room If You Overthink Enough. And it's a blend of theatre, comedy and storytelling. I'm really proud of it. Oh my God, I'm so happy with the way this is going. Oh, everyone says that. Fucking hell. Got to find a new way of being proud of my work now, haven't I? But yeah, it's genuinely so different to anything I've ever done before. At least it feels that way for me. And and I think it's really exciting. So please come check that out. If you like this episode, you might also like my episode with director John Gordillo, where we delve into whether comedians need a director, the value of directing, and what you can actually get or expect from a session with him. Yeah, I really love that episode, and I think it's very worth a listen if you liked this episode and the subjects that were touched upon within it. The RC Industry Podcast is a Fruit That Got in Gravity's Way production for the internet. All elements were created by me, comedian Simon Caine. Thank you very much for listening, thank you very much for subscribing, and thank you very much for rating and donating if you do. I'll see you all in about 14 days' time. Bye!